Now, moving on to the next two pages, pages 3 and 4, we want to establish some of the training aids or the guidelines relative to what the individual or individuals' background or experience should be relative to supporting the maintenance operation. So you will notice that on the top of page number 3, we have a bold heading that says considerations when selecting a supplier for spare parts. In no way are we advocating that purchasing has to be an equipment or a spare part design engineer, but working with your maintenance personnel, that is craft personnel as well as supervision, if there is facilities engineering available, working with those people, you start to get a good experience factor relative to the uniqueness of certain spare part requirements. So looking at the data elements and starting off with item 1, we generally address the question, how unique is the spare part? In other words, what function does it, let's say, perform? Are there potential substitutes? And you'll see we cover that in this exhibit a little later. But we should at least have an appreciation of the uniqueness of that particular spare part. What are the unique operational requirements? In other words, are there specific pressure or hydraulic or electrical or voltage, and current capability, and so forth? 3 is where we do have unique items as reviewed in 1 and 2, then how many different suppliers are there that can supply that item? And 4, which supplier has the best quality? You're going to see when we look at our appraisal program that quality is going to be the key factor relative to evaluating suppliers. And next, which supplier has the longest operational lifespan? I can go back to my experience working with hundreds of companies where we could purchase, let's say, the same bearing from 6 different bearing manufacturers. But 2 of those bearing manufacturers has a operational lifespan that is 20 to 25% longer than the other 4. And that's basically what we're trying to develop here. If we're paying the same price for an item and we have equal quality, then the next question is, what about the lifespan or the operational life of the item? And those are key characteristics that would assist purchasing and selecting the proper supplier for that type of an item. Which supplier has the best delivery record? The second major element in a supplier performance or appraisal program is delivery. And that's paramount, especially when we're purchasing items for planned maintenance work orders. Remember, the 2 major planning activities is labor and spare parts. So the spare part requirement is going to be extremely important to support the integrity of the maintenance work order planning and scheduling system. And as item number 7 indicates, are there alternate products? In other words, is there a substitution? Now, before any decision is made relative to obtaining a substitution, this should be reviewed by the maintenance supervisors, facilities engineers, and maybe with the original equipment designer to make certain that a substitute will give you the functionality and the performance and the quality relative to the operation of that particular asset. Now, moving on to page number 4, and continuing on some of the characteristics that are an integral part of the training of purchasing personnel, what is the operating history of alternate products, which is item number 8. You know, if there is an alternate, then what is the performance? Is it really giving us or will give us the type of operational lifespan that, let's say, the original item would? Item 9 is, again, important relative to the technical support that you will receive from, you know, key suppliers for major spare parts. There's an old saying in the maintenance and procurement environment: the designer, the manufacturer of a spare part knows more about that spare part than we do. And therefore, what we want to do is to tap that knowledge to obtain as much information as we can relative to the quality and the longevity and the functionality of critical or unique spare parts. Another key application, item number 10, and this goes back to our vendor stocking program, and that is, what are the suppliers' inventory policies? Now, maybe you cannot, with a specific supplier, establish a vendor stocking program. On the other hand, if you cannot, will the vendor carry some inventory for you? And here again, we would have to develop the lead time requirements so that the inventory system, along with the planning and scheduling system, that is the maintenance work order planning and scheduling system, would have the sufficient lead time for, let's say, stock replenishment or the delivery of spare parts to meet planned maintenance work orders. And item number 11 is, what are the supplier's warranty and service policies? And this is going to be critical, and it should be included in the purchasing item master record, as well as the inventory management item master record. Now, item 12 again is what additional item characteristics, additional data that you think you would like to have as an integral part of training, purchasing personnel to support the maintenance management program. And I have a closing paragraph here which addresses something that I said a little earlier. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Much of this information can be obtained from the craft personnel. Remember, these people have been in maintenance for many years. They have been changing spare parts. They look at spare parts that are being removed from equipment. They can give you a lot of input relative to supporting your educational enhancements within the purchasing organization. Now, moving on to the next 2 pages, pages 5 and 6, we are going to look at a very comprehensive spare parts purchasing profile for spare parts. Some of this information we've already looked at, but these are some very detailed requirements for, I'm going to say, unique, critical Class 1, Class 2 items as an integral part of our inventory class code and so forth. The first element is the part number. The second is the description. The third is the unit of measure. And the fourth, now we're identifying the conversion requirement. The fifth is the wear-use code, and it is a key requirement for purchasing to determine how critical that spare part would be as a byproduct of the wear-use code. 6 is the inventory class code, and 7 is the lead time as quoted by the supplier. 8 is the quantity required, and you should know in purchasing whether that quantity is for planned whether it's for unplanned or for both planned and unplanned requirements. Item 9 is the date required. And here again, we want to make certain that the dates are within the lead time of the supplier. Now, I recognize that it may be some emergencies where you may not have a part on hand and you need it ASAP. Those may happen and probably will. But for all of the other items that are an integral part of the inventory management program supported by purchasing, the lead time issue is going to be critical to be coordinated with the required date of the maintenance work order itself. We also need the maintenance work order number if required, so we can cross-reference the purchase order to the maintenance order and vice versa. I've discussed that a couple times. Now, what about special quality requirements? That should be an integral part of the purchase order itself. If there are special packaging requirements to support the transit into, let's say, your facility, that likewise should be noted on the purchase order. If there is a shelf life requirement, that shelf life code should also be an integral part of the purchase order. Naturally, the pricing of the item would be on the purchase order. And if there's any, let's say, quantity discounts, those would be negotiated with the supplier, and then that, let's say, quantity discount price would likewise be on the purchase order. You would have all the various supplier information that is required to issue not only a purchase order, but let's say a purchase requisition. It is sometimes appropriate to have the vendor part number on the purchase order, but the part number that really you're requiring should be your part number. The supplier description, if it is different from yours. And 18 is any warranty information. And moving on to the next page, item number 19 would be the supplier repair capability and lead time for that repair. 20 would be the manufacturer's part number. If the item is purchased from a supply house where you purchase an asset and the OEM of the asset is purchasing spare parts from a supply house. And in a moment, we're going to show you how to use the asset purchase ordering process to get that information for you. 21 would be shipping instructions, again, to either return material to the supplier or send material out for repair to a supplier. And then we would consider the current purchase order lead times, and then, as 23 indicates, additional informational requirements. Now, before we go to the next page, what we have identified in these two pages, pages 5 and 6, is the development of a rather comprehensive database, if you will, for the spare parts that are tied in specifically with suppliers. Now, much of this information is used by inventory management, and it is also used by the storeroom. Where we are in a CMMS requirement, we do not have to have 3 independent item master records. We can all use one item master record. And a little later, when we get into section number 6, which is the storeroom, we're going to address a singular item master record that can be used by all 4 of the planning activities within maintenance management. and that is work order planning, the inventory planning, purchasing planning, and the storeroom planning. So without further ado, let's talk about some of the responsibilities of purchasing relative to following up on purchase orders. That is covered on pages 7 and 8. These are some of the disciplines, and they also are the procedures that must be in place to support the receipt of material as required by the purchase order. Item 1 addresses the responsibility of purchasing, and that, as I said before, is purchasing's sole responsibility to follow up on purchase orders. The follow-up in item number 2 should be by due date. Now, in a CMMS program, you could sort the purchase orders by supplier, by due date within a supplier. You could sort that by, let's say, planned maintenance work orders and any other, sorting capability. The key is to be able to look into the future time periods in your shop calendar, that is the purchasing shop calendar, and follow up on purchase orders in advance. Don't wait to follow up on a purchase order today if the item was supposed to come in today. So you have the visibility, and if you have the system and the proper system, it will support that visibility and the follow-up requirements. Item 3 indicates that the purchase orders that are required for maintenance work orders, which are planned requirements, should be coordinated by purchasing with the maintenance work order planner and scheduler. Okay, this is that cross-reference between planning and scheduling and purchasing. Now, item 4 addresses the other issue. If the item is going to go into stores for future unplanned requirements, then that should be coordinated by the inventory system. And if we move on to the next page, item 5 illustrates that all purchase order rejections should be coordinated by purchasing and the maintenance work order planner and scheduler or inventory management. In other words, a receipt comes in, it's rejected, and there may be a planned order, or we may be at a very low bin on hand for future unplanned requirements. This is going to establish the communication network between these 3 activities, but also gives us the ability to maybe reschedule planned maintenance work orders or expedite the supplier based upon, let's say, a replenishment lot. Item 6 indicates that the purchase order rejects and replacement orders should have the highest priority. And that is especially true if we have a planned maintenance work order, or as I said a moment ago, the bin on hand for future unplanned requirements is going to deplete any inventory that we have at this point in time. And item number 7 is kind of the capstone. It indicates that purchasing's responsibility to support the receipt of the purchase order is not done until the purchase order is received in its completion, that is in its entirety, and that all of the requirements of the purchase order has been met. Now, what we want to do is to look at an outline, and that's covered on the next 2 pages, pages 9 and 10, on when we're going to purchase new equipment or new assets. Now, I know from experience, working with over 400 different companies, that when we issue purchase orders from equipment, we do not have all of this data on the purchase order as a line number. A line number indicates that it is a part of the purchase order contract. And naturally, before it should be on the purchase order, it should have likewise been on, let's say, the request for quotation. So let me walk you through these, and you could see the criticality of these items, especially if you don't address them when you're purchasing new equipment or new assets. The first item on the purchase order would be the equipment or asset itself. You may have a number for it, you would have a description, and you probably would have the quantity and also the price. Now, the second item on the purchase order would be the first item that we're going to address here on page 9. And so that these numbers on pages 9 and 10 do not necessarily indicate that they are line numbers. They're just numbers so that we can follow the individual data elements that I want you to consider when you are purchasing new equipment or assets. The first one is installation information. Now, we covered many of these data elements and the description of these data elements. So I'm not going to go into great detail at this point in time, but I'm going to highlight, okay, the reasons thereof. 2 is the dismantling and moving information. 3 is operational information. Now, 4 is going to be critical from the standpoint of the recommended spare parts list. 5 is the recommended PM program. Now, if we have the PM program recommended by the asset OEM, that's going to save considerable time to immediately establish the PM program for the asset when it arrives. Similarly, we have item number 6, the recommended major and minor overhauls. And then we get into other issues such as 7, the training of maintenance personnel, 8, the training of machine operators. Now that's going to support not only predictive maintenance, but it will support a TPM, total productive maintenance. And item 9 is the safety features of the equipment. 10 is warranty and service provisions. And then item 11 would be anything else that you require. Now again, I want to repeat, these are all line numbers that should appear on the original quotation, and they would also appear on the purchase order. Now, if you turn the page, you will see that we have a notation that is going to be at the bottom of the purchase order, and the notation illustrates that payment of the purchase order will not be made unless all of the line items that are on the purchase order are met. And it is extremely important that that notation be on the purchase order. In some cases, some of my clients have actually established a bank account and deposited the cash value for the equipment, so that if the supplier made a query and thought, well, maybe you're trying to play games with him and you're not, that the money is in a bank account, it will be released, predicated upon receiving all of the items. Now, the last item on page number 9 says other information that is required. I could think of a couple, such as we are buying more and more equipment offshore. Therefore, any documentation you receive should be translated into basic English. If you have, as an example, offshore procurement of equipment, you want to make certain that the voltage and current characteristics are going to meet the U.S. standards, like 60 cycle, 110, 220, and so forth. Those are some applications that sometimes we overlook. And this is extremely important to support the maintenance management program. Now on pages 9 and 10, we reviewed the data that is recommended for the procurement of new equipment or new assets. You'll notice that on this screen capture, we've provided you with some of the key data. Now, those boxes that appear on this particular screen format are confined based upon the data elements that you may want to have on your particular purchase order. So here again, we're merely demonstrating the need to put this information into the purchasing module in CMMS, and this particular screen can be expanded to 2, 3, 4 individual screens based upon the data that you would require for each and every new asset or new piece of equipment that you're purchasing. We're merely trying to demonstrate again, user defined. You select what you need for a specific purchase order, put the data into the individual data elements where they are identified on the screen format, and then when you print out your purchase order, the data will be printed out accordingly. There's one additional comment I would like to make relative to this particular exhibit, and that is on page number 10, I identified a particular note that should be placed on the purchase order. You'll notice at the bottom of this particular screen format, I have a box identified as other information as required. That should be viewed twofold. One, additional data that is not identified on page number 9 in the notebook, and number 2, the notation that I have provided you with on page number 10. So here again you have the opportunity to define your specific data requirements as you are purchasing new pieces of equipment or assets. And one last comment. You could, as an example, have different screen formats for different data elements, and therefore once you select the proper screen format, all you have to do is put the appropriate data in for that purchase order, and it will become an integral part of the hard copy once the purchase order is printed out. Now, continuing on, we have some exhibits here that we want to review, which is really coordinating purchasing with the storeroom. And the first one on page number 11 is receiving validation. The first item is early receipts. That means the supplier shipped ahead of schedule. Well, you may want to receive that material, but hold payment until the actual payment is due based upon the original receipt date that's on the purchase order. How do you handle overshipments? If it's for a planned requirement and there may not be any future need for that item for some period of time, then you may want to return the overshipment to the supplier. If it's for future unplanned requirements, you have a judgment call to make. Do you want to place that additional inventory into the storeroom? How do you handle partial shipments? You may need a full quantity for a planned maintenance work order, and a partial doesn't support you. So there's going to be some expediting and vendor follow-up required. Non-conformed packaging. You wanted an item to be packaged a particular way, and it wasn't. How are you going to establish the packaging requirements with that supplier to make certain that the next shipment is packaged properly? Non-conformed carrier. We wanted to have a specific carrier based upon not only the carrier's delivery performance, but the quality and the handling performance, but yet we have the wrong carrier that was selected by the supplier. Again, we have another communique to the supplier. And invalid receipts means that the label on the container was addressed to me, the label was accurate, but inside the container we had the wrong item. That means your parts are at somebody else's receiving area because that label for that company was accurate, but the parts are incorrect. Now, my recommendation for these items called receiving validation is for you to establish the procedures in terms of how the storeroom and the purchasing function is going to support these particular receipts when they occur. And continuing on, we have on the next page 12, we're going to be talking about receive and inspection. Now this is becoming more and more an integral part of the storeroom responsibility. As you do more and more planning, you're going to reduce your total inventory investment. And we're going to be doing more and more vendor stocking. That means that the delivery date must be met, the quantity must be accurate, but most importantly, the quality must be accurate. And that's one of the key inputs into vendor performance or appraisal and also vendor certification. So some of the issues now relative to receive and inspection is to determine where an item is going to be inspected and or tested. In some cases, you may not have the test or inspection equipment, and maybe a third party should be used to support that type of an activity. When a third party is used, you want to make certain that that inspection lead time is added to the aggregate lead time that is in the inventory management system. You also want to determine the level of inspection. That is, what AQL, assured quality level, are we going to inspect to? Or are we going to inspect to 100% inspection? Third would be sample sizes for, let's say, new products, new items. How many would you need, and how are you going to test those? In some cases, it would require the actual implementation of that item in a piece of equipment or an asset, and actually determine its operational, requirements. Sample testing and analysis would involve such things as lubrication and other types of analysis relative to determining the internal wear of machinery or other operating equipment. The next element is the gauges and equipment that are going to be required by receiving inspection. And remember, we want to assure ourselves that the quality exists. Don't be penny wise and pound foolish. If we have to spend a couple $100 on the proper gauges and equipment, my recommendation is to do so that when a part is received and inspected, we have assurance that we have an excellent quality product. Again, where we have inspection internally, we have to consider the lead times of that inspection process. And last are the special supplier documents that you may have. Some of those could be certified documents. Others can be warranty documents. And again, in this particular analysis of receive and inspection requirements, I urge you to develop the different procedures that will support those that we've just addressed, and any others that you feel should be added to this particular list. Now, moving on, we have another series of considerations, and that is identified on page 13 by the subject of receiving disposition. We would hope that everything we receive would be acceptable, and that's the first item. But we know, based upon supplier performance in the past, we're going to have some probably quality or other issues. So the disposition of those quality or other issues are as follows. I may have to return the receipt back to the supplier. Again, this could have an impact on a maintenance planned work order, or it could impact future unplanned requirements. In some cases, it would pay to rework an item and use the item. In that case, we should get approval from the supplier relative to the rework costs associated with that particular process. Maybe we can sort a particular lot size received, which would be able to support a current planned or a current unplanned requirement, and the balance would have to be returned to the supplier for replacement. Here again, if there is a cost associated with it, we should likewise obtain the supplier's approval. And the last element is where we have an outright reject. It can't be repaired and salvaged, and rather than send that item back to the supplier at his or her transportation expense, maybe we should get the supplier's approval to literally scrap it out at our facility using our current surplus and scrapping procedures. Now, here again, we encourage you to develop the operating procedures and any system requirements to support these receiving disposition requirements or others. Now, the next document on page 14 is addressing the shelf life code. And I indicated several times previously in this period that we were going to discuss shelf life. The shelf life code is applied to the item or to the item's package or to the item's documentation by the manufacturer of that part. Item number 2, when purchasing an item with a shelf life code, one of the responsibilities of purchasing is to make certain that the shelf life code notation is put on the purchase order. The reason for that is when an item is received, the people in the receiving function of the storeroom can look for that shelf life code and compare it to the expiration date and the current date received. If the item may be, let's say, placed into stores for future unplanned requirements, and the inventory system can support this, they can calculate the average usage of that item, and if there's going to be any excess inventory beyond the expiration date, then that item should be returned to the supplier for replacement. But again, that must be coordinated by purchasing, inventory management for future unplanned requirements, and by planning and scheduling for current planned maintenance work orders. And you'll notice in item number 3, we're identifying the coordination of the shelf life code between the various activities. And let me address the language in item 3 with you. The receiving function has the responsibility of checking the manufacturer's shelf life code at the point of receipt. It is conceivable that the supplier you purchased the item from had the item on hand for a longer period of time than what the shelf life code indicates. You therefore could have purchased inferior merchandise which could have been critical to a particular machine breakdown. So again, the shelf life code is extremely important. Now, one of the procedures that I would recommend that you establish, and this can be done through CMMS, is to periodically query into all shelf life codes that are been on hand by, let's say, a future calendar date. As an example, let's say I'm going to ask the system to print out all of the part numbers, the quantities, and the bin locations whose shelf life codes are going to expire 60 days from the date, from today. And that gives me the ability, therefore, to look at any of those items, coordinate those items with planning and scheduling to determine if there's going to be any usage, and if not, then in the storeroom we can coordinate those return goods activities with purchasing. And that's really how a shelf life coding system should work. We want to have the visibility to support future shelf life code expiration dates that could be in our storeroom. Now, the next 3 pages pertains to supplier evaluation, and on page number 15 we're addressing the items in the order in which most companies would establish a supplier evaluation, or you may call it a supplier performance or appraisal program. We start off with number 1, quality, then second, delivery, third is the quantity issue, cooperation is generally coordinated by purchasing, then we have packaging, transportation, and last, price. Yes, price is no substitute for quality, delivery, and the accuracy of quantity. Now, if you turn the page and go to page number 14, we're showing how we have distributed a 100 weighting point system for supplier performance or appraisal. Again, taking the same data elements that were on the preceding page, we are now distributing a 100-point weighted system relative to these items. And once this has been established, then we are in a position to start evaluating vendors' performance relative to the quality, the delivery, the quantity, and so forth. And let me take a moment and walk you through some of the procedures that I will recommend to establish this type of a program. And remember, the end result is to get it into vendor certification, which is really the forerunner for just-in-time applications. Now, when you first establish a supplier performance or appraisal program, one of the first things you're going to do is to determine what suppliers are going to be evaluated. And remember, these are for critical spare parts. They're not necessarily for the hardware items or any other items that you could buy, let's say, from a supply house. And once you've developed the suppliers, then you're going to develop a list of those suppliers, and that list would contain the supplier number. And you should develop a communique, a letter to the suppliers indicating that they are going to be an integral part of your supplier performance program. You should also, with that letter, address the quality, the delivery, and the quantity items that appear on page number 16. You'll also indicate the weighted point distribution as also is shown on page 16. You should also have an illustration of an example of a weighted point program, which I'll address for you in a minute. And another key important item is to indicate to the supplier that they will get a report every quarter. And if they can maintain a 100-point report for one full year, then they will be certified, and therefore material need not go through receiving and the receiving inspection activities, but they will be received, and they could be delivered directly to the job site if they're for planned items, or go right into the storeroom for future unplanned items. Now, here is an example of a weighted point program. Let's assume, and I'm only going to take the first item, quality. Let's assume in the first quarter I have received 10 shipments. One shipment was rejected. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the 30 points by 9/10, 9 over 10. And therefore, when that 9/10 is converted into its decimal equivalent, it would be 0.9. 0.9 times 30 is 27. And that is the way the balance of the individual items would be calculated. The only calculation that really would not be required would be cooperation, and that is fixed unless the individuals in purchasing would want to make an adjustment to those 10 points, as we have that established on page number 16. Now we add up all of the points after the calculation, and like I said, they should equal 100. Well, in the illustration I just used, the first item has 27 points, and let's assume everything else is received according to our particular performance program, and if we totaled it, we would have a total of 97 points. Now, when we introduce the program, as I said a moment ago, to the supplier, what we want them to do is to have 100 points earned for every quarter for one full year. In this illustration, the supplier only earned 97 points for a quarter. So that means that that supplier is now going to be on another extended full year program. It's like a running one-year program in advance until that supplier can prove to you that he or she is meeting all of the performance requirements, which is an integral part of your particular program. It is very important to make certain that when the program is introduced, it is sent to the chief executive officer of the company and not the sales department, not order entry. And all of the reports should likewise be sent to the chief executive officer. The report that he or she would get would be ranked from the highest to the lowest by vendor number. And only that particular supplier would know his or her vendor number. But it gives them an opportunity to compare their ranking against the other vendors that are going to be an integral part of this performance program. And we have found, again, working with many, many companies that have established this type of a program, that you're going to find that the CEO wants to be certified, and he's going to support any requirement within his organization to make certain that that supplier is meeting all of your performance characteristics. Now on page number 16, we reviewed the weighting points relative to a vendor or supplier performance or appraisal program. I've gone into the utilization of the weighted points and how the system actually works. These points that are on your particular screen format are shown as an illustration only. You have to develop the items that you want to track a supplier by, and those appear on the left-hand side of the screen, starting off with quality and ending up with price. So you don't have to have all of those data elements on this particular screen format. Here again, you have the flexibility to design the vendor performance or appraisal program based upon you and your management requirements. You may want to have more than one weighted point system. That depends upon the selection of, let's say, very key individual spare part items like motors, gear reducers, transformers and transmissions, and so forth, the high dollar items, as, let's say, compared to items like electrical supplies, and in even some cases some bearings and other what I would call lower priced items. And one of the things that I did not go into in greater detail while going through this portion of the notebook is the ability to have more than one vendor performance and appraisal program. But here again, what we're merely trying to demonstrate is the flexibility that you have when you are defining your CMMS requirements. So pick and choose, develop your performance and appraisal program, and then review those requirements with your CMMS supplier. Now if you would turn to the next page, 17, which is the last page in this particular section. These are some of the key benefits of the program. Item 1, it establishes for quality control a uniform supplier performance rating program. Secondly, it would highlight the worst to the best. In other words, the worst would be at the bottom of the list in descending ranking order. It establishes both current and historical data for each supplier. In other words, you're going to compare this quarter's results with last quarter. And the name of the game is to work with the suppliers so that they are operating at a 100% performance point weight. And once that is accomplished, then the last item on page 17 illustrates the end result, which is it leads into a supplier certification program. Now, we have covered a lot of information in this procurement program. And it is important that those of you that are going to be responsible for purchasing in the maintenance management program review the data in section 5 as much as required so that you thoroughly understand the responsibilities of purchasing within maintenance management, and most importantly, the integration in CMMS between purchasing and all other functional activities within the maintenance management program. Now, in section 6, we're going to discuss the responsibilities of the maintenance storeroom or crib. And the first thing we're going to do is look at the title page, which addresses the function or module 5, and that represents the 5th module within CMMS. And the first paragraph really illustrates the mission of the maintenance storeroom, and that is to house all of the maintenance spare parts, special tools and equipment that may be required by maintenance personnel to support a maintenance work order, and house any other maintenance supply items that may be used by maintenance personnel and maintenance work orders. The second paragraph indicates the interrelationship of the storeroom to the other 3 planning functions. That is inventory management, purchasing, and the maintenance work order planning and scheduling system. Now, moving on to the next page, we have the recommended record layout for the storeroom item master. And again, we're following the same format as we have in the previous sections where we have addressed the individual record layouts. We have 3 columns. The first column addresses the record by an alpha code. The second or middle column identifies that alpha code, and then the right-hand column addresses the recommended field size and also whether you're going to use either alpha, numeric, or both alpha and numeric characters in the item master record. So let's take a look at the first one so that, again, we have an opportunity of addressing all of these items on this particular record layout. A pertains to the item part number. And moving over to the right, we're indicating that you may want to consider a field size of 15 digits for that part number. And as I said previously, these record layouts are only recommended for your perusal and subsequent use. You could change the field sizes to meet your own specific requirements. It also indicates that that 15-digit field size should accommodate both alpha and numeric requirements. And that's how you read the balance of all of the data elements on this particular exhibit entitled Warehousing Stores Record Layout. Now, moving on to pages 1 and 2, we're going to talk about some of the data elements now over and above the record layout relative to the storeroom. And here's where we get into a little greater detail. And starting off on A, we have the spare part number. We would have the description as B illustrates. Now C pertains to not only the unit of measure for storage, but it also pertains to the unit of measure of receipt and also the unit of measure of issue. So here, where we may have different units of measure, we would have conversion, requirements, and therefore the capability of that conversion requirement should be in CMMS. Item D is the receiving steps, and the first one is an authorized receipt. That would pertain to either the label on a container, the bill of lading, and any other documentation that is forwarded to you by a supplier. It could be an authorized receipt due to an inter-plant transfer, meaning one facility to another, or it could also be a return of an item from, let's say, a previously issued maintenance order. The second activity under receiving is material identification. And here is a major discipline of the storeroom. Nothing enters the storeroom unless it is properly identified. And the identification, as you'll see in a moment, addresses three elements: the part number, the description, and the unit of measure. And then we have step 3 is the quality issue, which is receive and inspection. And the fourth is to count the material. This is the first and only time to verify the accuracy of the quantity being received. And then we get into E, which is the various bin locations if there's more than one. And the next item, F, is the disbursement procedures. And you notice one under there says record adjustments. There are 2 records that would be adjusted based upon a disbursement. One would be the storeroom record card itself, and the other is the inventory management record. So we want to make certain that the bin on hand and the inventory record is accurate. G pertains to any tools and or equipment that may be required by maintenance work orders. H is the shelf life coding system, which we addressed a little earlier in section number 5 in purchasing. Then we get into the cycle counting program, which is I, and that was discussed in detail in section number 4 when we were in inventory management. Now continuing on to page number 2, we have the security requirement of the storeroom. And if you remember, when we were in section number 4, I said I'm going to bring this security issue up again, and I am. And I'm very sincere when I say the storeroom must be secure in order to have data integrity within the entire maintenance management program. K is another term for a bench stock or 2-bin system, and in this case, we're calling it free stock. These are 3 of the common terms that are used in industry. And then L, excuse me, is the staging area for maintenance work orders. They could be planned, they could be unplanned, and a little later in this section, we're going to talk about all of the other considerations relative to the various commodities and families and inventory class codes in terms of how they can be an integral part of the layout and where those materials would actually be stored. And again, item number M is any additional information that you feel is required in this item master record. Now continuing on, page number 3 is an indication of the objective or the mission of the maintenance storeroom. And it's very simple. It is to provide a warehousing service to the maintenance department. And a way to look at this is that the customers of the maintenance storeroom are the maintenance organization, or is the maintenance organization. And therefore, if the maintenance organization understands the criticality of, let's say, accuracy of bin on hand, then you can appreciate that any transactions that are made in the storeroom, let's say on the second and third shift, would have to be recorded to maintain the integrity of the data in the storeroom. And we're going to discuss the second and maybe third shift transactions a little later in this section. But the key is that they are responsible to maintain the spare parts, the tooling and equipment, and other applications that may be stored in the storeroom, and they are maintained by modern inventory management applications, which are an integral part of the inventory management program. So if you really want to take a look at the domino effect, if you will, in spare parts planning, it goes something like this. The maintenance work order and planning and scheduling system generates requirements for craft and spare parts. The spare parts requirement is recorded in the inventory record. And there are two types of recording, planned and unplanned. If there is insufficient quantity in the inventory record, then there is a purchasing requirement to purchase the spare part from a supplier. And then ultimately, that spare part is received by the storeroom. Now that's the interrelationship of those four planning activities. So you can see the storeroom is really the fourth planning element within that chain of the four planning elements that I just described. So it is important that we understand the interrelationship of the storeroom to the other three planning issues within the maintenance organization. Now, moving on to page number 4, we have described the different functions of the maintenance storeroom. These functions or activities should be developed into procedures, and they likewise should be developed into training requirements so that everyone in the maintenance storeroom can perform any function at any point in time based upon the training that those individuals should receive. And let's take a walk through the different activities in kind of sequence that they occur. First, we receive the material. Secondly, we identify the material. And here again are those three identification items. We have the part number, we have the description, and we have the unit of measure. Third, we verify the quality. That's through receive and inspection. Fourth, we count the material. And here's where we have to support this activity with proper counting equipment. And then 5, we actually store the material by some bin location or locations. Now, once these receiving steps have occurred from, let's say, 1 through 5, then the storeroom gets into what we call the issuing mode. So item number 6 is we actually issue material out of the storeroom against both planned and unplanned requirements, and their records are updated relative to bin on hand by location. And 7, the disbursement is made either to a craft person or it could be delivered to the job site but 8 indicates that all disbursements are recorded. So we have the bin location system that is updated through a disbursement, and like I said previously, we have the inventory management record that is likewise updated based upon bin on hand. Item 9 addresses the issue of issuing out and tracking both tools and special equipment that is required. And the 10th activity is the cycle counting program. So if you look at these 10 activities, I think it becomes quite clear that you can develop the procedures for these activities, the interrelationship of these procedures, and then convert those procedures into training programs for all of the people that are going to be an integral part of the maintenance storeroom. Now, moving on to the next series of pages, of which there are 6, starting off with page number 5, we're going to address that item master record that I made reference to earlier. Remember, in CMMS, it is not necessary to have an inventory record which is independent of purchasing, which is independent of the storeroom. We can each indicate what data elements are required in a unified item master record, and then each one of the planning functions would utilize their portion of the item master record. However, the data in the item master record would be available for all of the 4 planning activities that we have been alluding to. So the first series of data elements are entitled General Information. General Information says that any one of the 4 planning activities will use that data, such as 1, the part number, 2, the description, 3, the unit of measure, and here we have our different units of measure that may require conversion capability. 4, we have the unit cost. Now, the majority of the companies I have worked with have what is called a standard cost, a system that represents about 80% of the companies. Another 19% would use an average cost system, and then the balance of 1% would utilize other types of costing systems, such as an actual costing system, or FIFO, first in, first out, or LIFO, last in, first out. The costing system is the responsibility of the financial department to provide you with this type of data. Item 5 addresses how the item is obtained. Do we purchase it or do we manufacture it? And continuing on the next page, 6, we are going to look at some inventory information. So this would mean that the people in the inventory management function would utilize this data, but here again, it's available for all of the other planning functions. Item 6 addresses the inventory class codes. Now, if you remember from section 4, there are 18 different inventory classification codes. Here, we're only going to address 3. A is class 1, B would be class 2, and C would represent all of the other classifications. 7 is the where use code. 8 is the lead time of the item, whether it's purchased or manufactured. And then 9, 10, and 11 work together. And 9 is the inventory control technique code. And you remember that comes from our ordering matrix that we reviewed in section number 4. If there are more than one person that is going to manage the inventory management program, then we would also want to have item 10 the date that that technique code was established, and 11 illustrates who established that code. And this is merely to have an audit trail in case any questions came up later on in the program, that is your program, where we may want to, ask an individual why a particular technique was established for a specific part number. If we could take a moment with the data that we covered on pages 5 and 6, which is the general information and part of the inventory information for the item master record, for the storeroom and other users outside of the storeroom, I want you to take a look at this particular screen capture, which incidentally is in your notebook entitled page 6-1. And this screen capture addresses the various data that we discussed on pages 5 and 6. As an example, part number, description, unit of measure, unit cost, how obtained, whether it's make or buy, the different inventory information elements like the inventory class code that we've discussed before. You remember there were 18. The where used code, that comes from the where used spare parts listing, which is from section 3 of the notebook. Then we have the lead time for the particular item, inventory control technique, and so forth. Okay, so this is the first of 3 different screen captures that will cover all of the data elements that are in the item master record. Now moving on to page number 7, we have again some additional inventory information. Here we have item 12, the ABC code. Now in this case, that's going to be used by the storeroom personnel. Item 13, we have the cycle count frequency code, and that is the date code. That is an integral part of the software for cycle counting, which was discussed in section 4. Item 14 is the purchase order cost. 15 is the manufacturing setup cost, where you manufacture the item. And 16 is the inventory carrying cost. And if you remember, we discussed items 14 and 16 in section 4. We showed you this here balancing scale with the fulcrum. And item 17 addresses the shelf life code. Now, moving on to page number 8, we have some storage information. Now, this basically would be used by the storeroom itself, but it should be supported by purchasing. As an example, item 18 is the maximum quantity stored. Now, we can calculate the maximum quantity stored with the following information. The maximum quantity stored is equal to 1/2 the previous order quantity plus the new order quantity. And that can lead into a storage bin size code, which is represented by item 19. In other words, we could identify through a coding system various storage requirements, such as skid racks, shelving, cantilevers, drawers, carousels, and any other type of application. We could likewise develop within each one of those storage requirements storage sizes. That is, sizes by cubic displacement, or in cantilevers, the width between cantilever arms, and let's say the maximum weight that you can put into one cantilever section. And that will help us to develop the storage bin size coding system. And in our program, maintenance storeroom, we do go into the derivation and the illustration of how those codes are actually developed and used. Item number 20 is the number of storage bins required. Well, that's a byproduct of calculating 18 and comparing it to 19 in terms of where is that maximum quantity going to be stored. And then 21 would be special storage environment considerations, and those are basically dictated by OSHA, by EPA, and other types of governmental agencies, or maybe by your own insurance carrier. The coding as appears under 21 would be the coding that you may want to consider putting into an item master record. Like coding 21A would indicate that that material has flammability associated with it. For each one of these special storage environments, you must develop the procedures on how you're going to receive, how you're going to store, and how you're going to issue these items out of the storeroom. And that is a self-contained requirement for items that require special storage environmental considerations. Now, moving on to the next page, number 9, we have additional storage information such as 22 indicates the physical characteristics of the part number, such as the size and the dimensions, the weight, the bulkiness, or other items of consideration relative to physical characteristics. Now, the same calculation can be used to develop the maximum quantity stored. And likewise, that would be the input into the selection of the appropriate storage bin size numbering scheme. Item 23 addresses the pilferage code, which means that these items would be housed in a bonded crib within a warehouse. We discussed that earlier in section number 4, but here's where we're actually going to implement that type of storage procedure. The next screen capture, which in your notebook is identified as page 9-1, addresses all of the item master record data that we discussed on pages 7, 8, and 9. On page 7, we concluded the different inventory information. Page number 8 started the various storage data elements for the spare part or other related material, and the storage information was concluded on page number 9. So all of this data is on this second screen format for the data in the item master record. And let me just address a few of the data elements in this particular screen format, such as the ABC inventory classification code, which is either A, B, or C, the cycle count frequency code, the purchase order cost if it is a purchased item, or the manufacturing setup cost if it's a manufactured part, the inventory carrying cost, which is the cost to carry inventory, which is provided to us by finance, and then up in the right-hand top we have the shelf life code. That shelf life code, if you remember, is the expiration date of the item, that is the spare part, that is provided by the manufacturer of that particular item. And then in the middle of the screen format, we have the storage information, such as the maximum quantity stored, the storage bin size code, and so forth. So you could see that with adding this second screen format to the previous screen format that was on page 6-1, we have 2/3 of all of the data that we have discussed thus far for our item master record. Moving on to page number 10, we have activity information which supports the layout of the storeroom. And the layout is done, number one, by commodity code or family code, and that is the first field, generally the first 2 digits of the part number, and then it is also used to determine where vertically we're going to store material relative to the bin system or the cantilever system or the carousel or file drawers and so forth. The activity information can be automatically developed for you through CMMS. All you have to do is to make certain that the CMMS has the activity requirements. Remember, user defined. So item 24 is annual usage. Well, we'll get that right from the inventory record. But how about 25, the number of annual disbursements or issues? That should come from the storeroom record. 26, the number of annual receipts. That should come from the storeroom record. 27, the number of annual cycle count errors. That likewise comes from the storeroom record. It also could come from the inventory record, where the storeroom and the inventory records had to be adjusted. And 28 is the number of cycle count inventory record adjustments, and likewise that can either come from the storeroom or from the inventory management program. Now again, I have a notation here. If other information is required in your item master record, please add it to this listing and develop your item master record to support your own requirements. Now this screen format, which is identified in the notebook as page 10-1, finalizes the item master record data, which actually is addressing activity information for the specific spare part. Things like annual usage, which actually is summarized from the inventory usage record, the number of annual disbursements, and likewise annual receipts, and then the number of cycle count errors as a byproduct of the cycle count system, and then any annual inventory record adjustments other than those detected by cycle counting. If you were to look at page 10 of the notebook, you will also see a note, and I have done this on every exhibit that has a lot of data elements included in the exhibit, such as other information as required by the user. So here again, this is the third screen format, which concludes the item master record data. And here again, you have to pick and choose the information that you feel would be necessary for the various users of the item master record. And to identify those users, let me just take a minute and address the person or personnel that are responsible for maintenance work order planning and scheduling. Then we would have the people for inventory management, those that are responsible for purchasing, and last, those that are going to be responsible for the maintenance storeroom or crib. All of those individuals will utilize some of the information that we have identified in the item master record data. Now moving on to the storeroom program itself, we want to talk about some organizational considerations and also some areas that may require, as an example, operating procedures and also the disciplines associated with those procedures. From an organization standpoint, we will take a look at what I call a functional organization, which is on the next page, page number 12. But the organization would consist of, number one, a supervisor, and then from a functional standpoint, the receiving activity, the receiving inspection activity, the counting activity, the put-away activity, the filling of orders, the consolidation, meaning putting two or more locations into one. That's part of what I call storeroom housekeeping, and then the cycle counting activity. Now, where we deliver material to the job site to support the maintenance work order scheduling system, then we would have what I call a material handling or movement activity. So these are some of the considerations that you may want to consider relative to organization. Item 2, from the layout of the storeroom, you want to consider inventory classification or commodity codes. It is my recommendation that you use the commodity codes because that commodity code is the first field of the family identification of the part number system. And as I said earlier, the commodity code is the way you want to address store's layout. You want to make certain you have the disciplines of everything coming in, being stored and issued, always has permanent identification. And again, those three identification requirements are part number, description, and unit of measure. Now, item number 4 addresses the procedures and the systems and the disciplines that I alluded to a moment ago. The ordering, which is the reordering of, let's say, material from a supplier through, let's say, the vendor stocking program, the receiving and the receiving inspection, the storage, the issuing, and the cycle counting. And again, let me preface my comments I made earlier. I behoove you to consider the development of the procedures and the systems and the disciplines. Put it in writing and use that as a training aid. There are different forms and records that are an integral part of the storeroom. Those are user-defined, and therefore you should collect all of the forms and all of the records, and item 6, all of the management reports, and put those into a 3-ring binder. And make certain that every person in the storeroom has a set of those forms, the records, and the reports in their own 3-ring binder. That is the least expensive way, but it is the most consistent way to train all of the storeroom personnel. Item 7 addresses the layout issue, and here again, I want to reference layout should be done by commodity or family code. Item 8 is that a naughty term called security. And again, I can't emphasize the importance of security. 9 is the safety condition within the storeroom. And that means that we want to set up some discipline such as no material is to be put on the floor. Secondly, no material should protrude out, let's say, out of the lip of a shelf or a bin. Those can become danger areas that could maim people. And next we have the proper equipment that is required in the storeroom. And 11 is the training program for storeroom personnel. And if you put that 3-ring binder together, with any additional training material for each and every person. I'll guarantee you'll have an excellent training program for your storeroom. And 12 would be the various data processing applications as required. That would pertain to, as an example, terminals, maybe different types of printers, and also would encompass, let's say, a modem and a telephone where we're going to utilize vendor stocking. And if you remember, we identified that procedure in section number 4. And last but not least, you may want to consider barcoding applications in the storeroom. Now, moving on to the next page, we have those 5 functions indicated in the organization chart. Remember, these are not people, these are functions. And again, we do have some storeroom supervision. It could be a foreman, it could be a group leader, it could be, a supervisor. I'm not too much interested in title, but somebody should have the responsibility to manage the storeroom. Then the functions, moving from left to right, are receiving and inspection. Next we have stocking and record keeping, that is quantity by bin location. The next we have the order filling, and then the next one is the cycle counting, which is a byproduct of the inventory control system, and the last one on the right pertains to the material handling requirement. So you could use this functional organization to identify who the people are that are going to perform those activities, and that may be an initial organization. And then, as I've indicated before, it is my recommendation that everyone in the storeroom be trained to support any of these functions as they occur. Now, moving on to the next 2 pages, 13 and 14, we're looking at a more definitive analysis of the receiving activity in the stores. I've broken this down into 3 separate steps. The first one is the receiving step, but within that step, we want to verify that the material is definitely ours. We want to inspect containers, and if there's any damage on a container, we want to note it on the bill of lading, and we want to make certain that the carrier also signs the bill. And the last element illustrates that you may want to take an instamatic picture of that particular container condition, and that information can be used very successfully by purchasing and finance to support any litigation relative to the replacement of damaged material and actually who caused the damage. Now, step number 2 is the verification of count. But here what we're identifying is that every container must have some identification document with it. And on that document, we want to verify by individual badge or name number and the date of the count, the date of the receipt, what the actual count is, so that every container has its own identification relative to where it came from, when it was received, and actually who verified the count. Now, moving on to the third step, we are addressing the quality control issue. And here again, we're going to use the same document where we're going to verify receiving inspection, which is verify supplier's quality, prepare supplier quality assurance report, and that can be done through a terminal for the purchase order, but most importantly, we want to insert the quality assurance report in each container, which is utilizing the same data element that we actually recorded the count on. And then we want to distribute the quality reports as they are required by your own internal procedure. And last, the material should be moved to the storeroom for either to be placed against a planned maintenance work order, or they should be placed into storage for future unplanned requirements. Now next, we want to take a look at the data elements for the shipping function, and this pertains to those storerooms where we're going to either return material back to a supplier, or we're going to ship material out to a supplier for repair. The easiest way to establish the shipping function is to have someone from your shipping department, if you have a shipping department, come in and help set up the entire shipping process. It's the easiest, it's the least expensive way to establish the shipping activity. Some of the data elements that you want to consider is the shipping order number. Now that could be a purchase order number. We also want to make certain we have the part number, the description, and the next item addresses the unit of measure. Then we have the quantity we're actually shipping and the date of the shipment. Now the next item pertains to the method of shipment, and the method would dictate the type of shipping document that would be required, which follows the method of shipment. On the shipping document, we also would record the number of containers, if there's, one or more, and also the gross weight, because most carriers charge by gross weight. And if somebody did the packing, let's say in addition to the person performing the shipping activity, then from an audit trail standpoint, we may want to consider having the individual that did the filling and the packing to indicate their badge numbers or names on our internal source document, and then the individual that actually did the shipping would note his or her badge number. And once the shipment is made, then you would distribute the shipping documents based upon, again, your own internal procedures. Now, if we're shipping directly out of the storeroom, and especially for repair items, we would use the purchase order number that had been supplied to us by purchasing. So therefore, we do not have to get purchasing involved. The storeroom personnel can contact the supplier directly. Where we're returning material, let's say as a receipt, and then a subsequent return to the supplier, then we definitely want to get the purchasing department involved. So the data elements under shipping requirements are key considerations when you're going to ship out of the storeroom. As I've indicated in touring through the notebook, that the storeroom is becoming self-contained. And again, my definition of self-contained is they receive directly into the storeroom, they store and issue material, and we are now shipping out of the storeroom. And those shipments could be shipments to suppliers, they could be for interplant shipments, or maybe to contractors. The data that we reviewed on page number 15 is shown on this particular screen format. And again, without trying to be redundant in reading all of the information on this particular screen, these data elements complement all of the data elements that are identified on page 15. Remember, you have the opportunity to format the data that you and your management will require for keeping track of data that is shipped out of the storeroom over and above the transactions that are to be recorded for all material that has been issued to the various maintenance work orders. Now, the next series of documents, which starts off on page number 16 and is concluded on page 18, is the cycle counting process. And here again, we went through the procedure of developing cycle counting. Here what we're going to do is talk about the implementation of the cycle counting process. Some of the data elements that we've discussed previously are also going to be identified here. So starting off with item 1 on page 16, we're going to establish the cycle counting interval. Those are the intervals for the A, B, and C items. And if you remember, the A item, you're going to count that 4 times a year minimum, the B twice a year minimum, and the C items once a year minimum. Item 2, the cycle count interval codes are the date codes. So within the cycle count software, within CMMS, we would have a printout every day as we identified in section number 4, so many A, so many B, and so many C items to be cycle counted for that particular day. We want to talk about item 3, the acceptable variances, and those were identified in section 4. But again, the A items must be 99.5% accurate, that is count to the bin on hand. The B items must be 99.0% accurate, count to bin on hand, and the C items 95% accurate, again, count to bin on hand. Item 4 addresses the cutoff procedures. Now, we did not talk about cutoff procedures in section number 4, but here are some things to consider relative to cutoff. How about orders to be filled? Where are they? Orders that are filled but have not been issued, that means that the bin on hand has not been reduced by the quantity we've actually applied to the order. Orders filled, issued, but the inventory record was not updated. The storeroom record was, but the inventory record was not. Material received and not stored. Well, that means I have received the material, but as long as I didn't put it to bin on hand, the inventory record, that is the one in the storeroom and in the inventory management system, would not recognize that material to be available. And item E is material received, stored, but the inventory record has not been updated, but the storeroom record was updated. Now, these cutoff procedures could have a negative impact on the cycle count program. What you want to do as an integral part of the cycle count printout, for all the parts that are on the printout, you want to have CMMS provide you the following information for those parts. Are any of those parts currently on order? And what is the due date? Are any of those parts currently required for planned, or are there unplanned maintenance work orders that are going to be processed? With that information available as an integral part of the cycle count form, you will eliminate potential cut-off problems. Item 5 is the training requirement of cycle counting. Cycle counters have to be trained, and the training is really done by the store's supervisor. And moving on to page number 17, here we're addressing when cycle counting is done and when there is opportunities to do other physical inventories which will enhance cycle counting, but they are not a substitute for cycle counting itself. So 6A indicates that we will cycle count based upon the interval code. B identifies another opportunity to take a physical when the record is 0. You don't need counting equipment to accomplish that task. C, when a new order is received. That means the inventory should be at its lowest level. D is where you can't locate material. That would mean that maybe 2 records are in error. But if you have the bin layout, okay, by, let's say, commodity code, and all the parts within the family are in a very small geographic area, it wouldn't take long to determine what parts had the wrong identification tags associated with it. And last but not least, when a material shortage is recognized, take a look at the bin on hand to make sure that there is truly a shortage. And you may want to indicate F on this exhibit, and that is when the bin on hand is negative. That means I put material in the bin, I didn't update the record, and I issued material out where there was a 0 balance. That's another kind of check and balance within the inventory record accuracy program. As you take the cycle count under 6A, you're going to report the physical count on the cycle count form, which is step number 7. We're going to review that count to the inventory record, and we could do this either by the storeroom record or the inventory management record. Remember, those 2 bins on hand should be equal to one another. And if there is an error, then we would have to go back and, let's say, recount the material, which is done in step number 10. And then if there is a reconciliation, the records should be updated, and the cycle count form, as we indicated in section number 4, would be forwarded to the financial department. Now, I mentioned when we were in section number 4 that when we get into the storeroom, we're going to provide you with the data elements that you may want to consider on the cycle count form. So on page number 18, we're addressing the data elements that are printed out by CMMS and the cycle count sub-module. The data would be as follows: the part number, the description, the unit of measure. Now item 4, quantity on hand is left blank. That has to be filled in by the cycle counter. 5 is the date cycle counted. 6, the individual that did the cycle counting. 7, the inventory record card quantity. And 8, is there a variance? If any, it would have to be recorded. We'd have to go through the reconciliation again. And then if there is a variance, then we would use the unit cost, and we would actually calculate in step number 10 the dollar variance, and also, where possible, the reason that caused the variance and the corrective action that is taken to eliminate any future errors for that specific part number. And then again, this form would be forwarded to the financial department.